When we think about the transatlantic slave trade, we often focus on the same narratives. But there are crucial facts that rarely make it into our history books. Today, we're uncovering the untold stories that change how we understand one of history's greatest atrocities. Fact 1. The scale was even larger than commonly taught. Most history classes teach that around 10 to 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic, but this number only counts those who survived the Middle Passage. When we include those who died during the initial capture and raids in Africa, the forced marches to coastal ports, sometimes hundreds of miles, the holding period in coastal dungeons, the Middle Passage itself, where mortality rates reached 15 to 25%. Historians estimate that for every person who arrived in the Americas, at least one more died in the process. This means the true human cost was closer to 20 to 25 million lives affected or lost. Fact 2. Africa's economic transformation. Here's what most people don't realize. The slave trade didn't just extract people from Africa, it fundamentally transformed African economies and societies. Before the trade intensified, many African regions had diverse economies based on agriculture, metalworking, textile production, and long-distance trade in goods. The slave trade created a devastating economic incentive structure. European goods, especially firearms, became essential for survival. Communities that refused to participate in slaving became targets themselves. Warfare increased dramatically as the demand for captives grew. Productive capacity was redirected toward capturing and trading people rather than producing goods. Some African leaders recognized this destruction. In 1526, King Afonso I of Congo wrote to the Portuguese king, pleading for an end to the trade, stating that Portuguese merchants were depopulating his kingdom. The long-term economic impact? Economists have calculated that the slave trade set back African economic development by centuries, effects we can still measure in GDP differences today. Fact: children made up a larger portion than you think. This is one of the most heartbreaking, untold facts. Children and adolescents comprised approximately 26% of those enslaved during the transatlantic trade. By the 19th century, as various nations banned the trade and enforcement increased, the percentage of children actually rose. Slavers could pack more children into ships, and children were easier to control and hide during inspections. These children were often separated from all family members, arrived speaking no European languages, and had no one to teach them about their heritage or origins. This systematic separation of children was a deliberate tool of cultural erasure. Fact 4. The seasoning process. When enslaved people arrived in the Americas, they underwent what was euphemistically called seasoning, a period typically lasting 1 to 3 years. This was actually a systematic process of physical brutalization to break resistance, forced adoption of new names, erasing identity, isolation from others who spoke their language, intensive labor under harsh conditions to adapt them to the climate. The mortality rate during seasoning was catastrophic, often 30 to 50%, in the Caribbean sugar colonies. In some places like Jamaica and Barbados, the death rate was so high that the enslaved population could only be maintained through constant new imports. This means that many enslaved people in the Caribbean experienced a double trauma, surviving the Middle Passage only to face conditions so brutal that most didn't survive their first few years. Fact 5. Resistance was constant and sophisticated. Here's what often gets left out. Enslaved people resisted constantly, in ways both large and small. Major rebellions. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, was the only successful slave revolt that led to an independent nation. There were over 250 documented slave ship rebellions during the Middle Passage. hundreds of plantation uprisings occurred throughout the Americas. Daily resistance, work slowdowns, and tool breaking, preservation of African languages, religions, and cultural practices in secret, poisoning of masters, so common it was a constant fear among slaveholders, running away. Over 100,000 escaped to form independent communities called Maroons in Jamaica alone, maintaining family bonds despite forced separations, teaching children to read in defiance of laws forbidding literacy. The narrative of passive victimhood is false. Resistance was sophisticated, continuous, and often successful in small but meaningful ways. Fact 6. The domestic slave trade in the U.S. was massive, 715 to 830. After Britain and the United States banned the international slave trade in 1807 to 1808, many people assumed the trade ended. It didn't, it moved. The domestic slave trade within the United States became enormous. Approximately 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860. This internal trade separated countless families. The domestic trade was so profitable that the total value of enslaved people in 1860 was greater than all American railroads and factories combined. Children as young as 8 were sold away from their mothers. The phrase, "sold down the river," comes from this trade, being sold to the brutal cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South. This was a second Middle Passage that traumatized multiple generations. Fact 7. European nations profited long after abolition. Britain abolished slavery in 1833 and often presents itself as an abolitionist hero. But here's the untold part. When Britain abolished slavery, the government paid £20 million in compensation, not to the enslaved people, but to the slave owners for their loss of property. This was roughly 40% of the government's annual budget at the time. British taxpayers were still paying off this debt until 2015. This means people alive today contributed tax money that originated as compensation to slave owners. Meanwhile, the formerly enslaved received nothing. Similar compensation schemes existed in other European nations. Additionally, European banks, insurance companies, and industries continued to profit from slavery-based products like cotton and sugar long after abolition in their own territories. Fact 8. The African diaspora's cultural contributions. Despite everything designed to erase African culture, the African diaspora created and preserved remarkable cultural traditions. Music, jazz, blues, gospel, reggae, samba, salsa, hip-hop, virtually all modern popular music traces back to African musical traditions preserved and evolved by enslaved people and their descendants. Food. Many crops that define regional cuisines, okra, black-eyed peas, rice cultivation techniques, were brought by enslaved Africans who maintained agricultural knowledge. Language. Creole languages throughout the Caribbean and beyond preserve African linguistic structures. Many English words come from African languages brought by enslaved people. Religion. Syncretic religions like Vodou in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, and Candomblé in Brazil preserved African spiritual traditions under the guise of Christian practice. Resistance to cultural erasure was itself a form of resistance to slavery. The untold facts of the slave trade reveal a history that is more devastating in scale than commonly taught, more complex in its economic and social impacts, more resistant and resilient than narratives of victimhood suggest, more recent in its effects than we often acknowledge. Understanding these facts isn't about assigning guilt to people living today. It's about understanding how this history shaped our modern world, from economic inequalities to cultural richness, from demographic patterns to ongoing racial disparities. These aren't just stories from the past, they're explanations for the present. If this video taught you something new, please like and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which fact surprised you most, or share an untold fact I didn't cover. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here and choosing where we go next.